This is a special day in Boston history, as you know, so we should at least keep a good thought for those who were hurt or killed a year ago. We should acknowledge the great work that Boston's first responders did on that terrible day. And we should acknowledge the professionalism and courage of law enforcement that tried to run those folk down before they could do more damage, including MIT's own Sean Collier, who was killed in the line of duty. Boston has done its commemorations today, but those of us who did not go to those commemorations should keep a good thought for all those who were involved. So we're here tonight to honor the memory of a great airman, a great MIT alumnus, General James Doolittle. Our speaker this evening and the recipient of the MIT Doolittle Award is General Janet Wolfenbarger, whom I will introduce later, but as you know, she's the commander of Air Force Materiel Command. She's made a lifetime of contributions to the development of American air power. And at MIT an alumna as well, so there's some commonality there across Doolittle and the General. But I just want to remind you of a few things about General Doolittle. He remains the only American to receive both the country's highest military and the highest civilian honors, the Medal of Honor and the Medal of Freedom. On April 18th, 72 years ago, a long time now, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle and 79 other volunteers launched 16 B-25s from the aircraft carrier Hornet to attack Japan. As you know, the B-25 was designed to take off land bases. Twin-engine bombers, not really designed for the deck of a carrier, and the deck of a carrier was not designed for these bombers. This was a joint Navy-Air Force operation. It's a major feat of flying skill. Then Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle was chosen to lead this mission, known as Special Mission Number 1, because he was known as the master of the calculated risk, who would apply both skill and science to pull off feats that seemed reckless and daring to others. Of the 80 men who took part in the raid, 3 were killed during the mission, 5 were interned in Russia, 8 became prisoners of war, but most made it back, including General Doolittle, who bailed out over China. For those of you who spend time in our office suite, there's a poster of the Hornet launching those aircraft next to my office, and it's signed by the surviving members of the Doolittle raid. For this, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle received the Medal of Honor. He was promoted to Brigadier General, skipping the rank of Colonel, which of course I guess everyone would like to do if they could. Although even that's, if the choice is skipping or doing that stunt, maybe you prefer not to skip. He accepted the Medal of Honor after the raid reluctantly, saying that he would do so on behalf of all the men who took part in the raid, and he vowed to spend the rest of his life living up to the honor, which he did. He had a very interesting life, both before and after this extraordinary feat of flying skill. He started his career as a prize fighter, and he fought under the name of Jimmy Pierce. He dropped out of UC Berkeley in 1917 to join the Army Signal Corps to attend pilot training. World War I ended before he could fly in Europe, but he quickly became an accomplished pilot and was known as a bit of a stunter. He would try almost anything in an airplane, and several of his stunts got him grounded. In September of 1922, he made the first of his many historic aviation feats, flying the first ever cross-country flight from Pablo Beach, Florida to San Diego in 21 hours and 19 minutes, making only one refueling stop in Texas. Why Texas? I don't know. Somewhere in this period, he found time to return to Berkeley and finish his bachelor's degree. I only discovered that later. I thought he never bothered to go back, and I felt badly about that because I'm a Berkeley PhD, but he did actually get his bachelor's degree from Berkeley. In 1923, he served as a test pilot and aeronautical engineer at McCook Field, Ohio, and then entered MIT, where he earned his master's degree in 1924, and in 1925 got the first PhD in aeronautics awarded by MIT. Now, see, in those days, no one knew much about airplanes or why they flew, so you didn't have to do much to move from a master's. He helped develop the artificial horizon and directional gyroscope and made the first flight completely by instruments on September 24, 1929. He later received the Harmon Trophy for experiments that made all-weather airline travel practical. Between 1925 and 1932, he won the 3 big air racing trophies of the day, the Schneider, the Bendix, and the Thompson, and then retired from air racing, saying, "I have yet to hear anyone engaged in this work dying of old age." In 1930, he left active duty but remained a reservist. He returned to active duty at the outset of the Second World War as a lieutenant colonel when he organized and led the raid. He went on to a very distinguished military career in World War II. In September of 42, he became commanding general of the 12th Air Force, which was soon to be activated in North Africa. He was then promoted to Major General and became commanding general of the North African Strategic Air Forces, which covered the entire central Mediterranean and included the British Air Force as well. He then commanded the U.S. 15th Air Force as it stood up in late 1943 in Italy to run strategic missions over Austria and Germany out of Foggia in southern Italy. And occasionally he still flew combat missions himself, which is quite extraordinary. Not only given his responsibilities, but also some of the things he knew, which would not have been good for the Allies, for the adversary to get a hold of. At this time, he became very good friends with General Patton, and they became close friends for most of their lives. In January of 1944, he took command of the 8th Air Force in England, which was flying heavy bombers against European targets. He apparently was the pioneer of the idea that the fighters escorting U.S. strategic bombers should detour on their way home and strafe German airfields, which turned out to be a good use of their munitions. He had that command until May of 1945 when they began moving the 8th Air Force to Japan, but that war ended, thankfully, earlier than anyone expected. After the war, he became a civilian and the first president of the Air Force Association. He devoted his energies to lobby for an independent Air Force, which seems to have been a success. I guess we have an independent Air Force. In March of 1951, he was appointed a special assistant to the Air Force Chief of Staff, serving as a civilian in scientific matters, which led to Air Force ballistic missile and space programs. He retired from duty in 1959, but continued to serve as chairman of the Board of Space Technology Laboratories and devoted his time to many other civic and industrial endeavors. He died on September 27, 1993, a great American, and we're here to celebrate him tonight. And after dinner, I'll introduce the general, and she can tell us about life in the Air Force today. So thank you. I'd like to introduce this year's recipient of the Doolittle Award and our speaker for this evening, General Janet C. Wolfenbarger. Is it Barger or Barger? Do I say? Barger, I got it right. Okay. You'll answer anything, yeah. Yeah. They call me Poison, so. She is commander of the Air Force Materiel Command at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, known as Wright-Pat among the initiates. The command employs some 80,000 people and manages $60 billion annually. These are numbers I can't even conceive of. And executes the critical mission of warfighter support through leading-edge science and technology, cradle-to-grave life-cycle weapons systems management, world-class developmental test and evaluation, and world-class depot maintenance and supply chain management. Big job. General Wolfenbarger was commissioned in 1980 as a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, began her career in acquisition as an engineer at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida. She has a variety of assignments at Headquarters Electronic Security Command and Air Force Systems Command. She's held several positions in the F-22 System Program Office at Wright-Pat. She was F-22 Lead Program Element Monitor at the Pentagon and was the B-2 System Program Director for the Aeronautical Systems Center, also at Wright-Pat. She commanded ASC C-17 Systems Group, Mobility Systems Wing. These are all the most important weapons programs in the Air Force of the last several years, at least as far as platforms are concerned. So she knows of what she speaks. She was the Services Director of the Air Force Acquisition Center of Excellence at the Pentagon, then served as Director of the Headquarters AFMC Intelligence and Requirements Directorate at Wright-Pat, and she served as AFMFC Vice Commander from December 2009 to December 2011. Prior to her current assignment, she was the Military Deputy Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition at the Pentagon, and she has a number of degrees. Bachelor of Science, we talked about already, from the U.S. Air Force Academy. She's a graduate of Squadron Officer School. In 1985, she has a Master of Science in Aeronautics and Astronautics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology here in Cambridge. She's a graduate of the Program Management course of the Defense Systems Management College at Fort Belvoir, Air Command and Staff College, and also has a Master of Science in National Resource Strategy from the Industrial College of the Armed Forces at Fort Leslie McNair. So it's my very great privilege to introduce General Janet Wolfenbarger.
So I wanted to say thank you all for having me here tonight. I want to especially thank the Security Studies Department for selecting me for what I consider to be a tremendously prestigious award. And I am really happy to return here to Cambridge and to MIT, where I have wonderful, fond memories of the time I was here going through my graduate studies in the 80s. So I have my thesis advisor here, Dr. Adams. It's been 30 years since I've seen Dr. Adams, and we have, I had a tour earlier today of the Draper Laboratory, and that was just wonderful, Jim, to have you show me where I used to sit when I was studying so hard, earning my master's degree from this great institution. So I've chosen to talk tonight about a title that I firmly believe, and I've had the opportunity, I think, to demonstrate here recently, and this is the title, Embracing Opportunities in a Changing Environment. So to set the stage just a little bit, our Secretary of the Air Force, the Honorable Deborah James, has said, with challenge comes great opportunity. And as you are all aware, because this is what you are all studying, you would appreciate that right now, our Department of Defense and our United States Air Force are currently experiencing some substantial budgetary challenges, and so that's kind of the challenging environment that I've chosen to refer to. And I truly do echo Secretary James's sentiment. I really believe that what we have facing us here is a reduced resource environment that brings with it tremendous challenge, tremendous change, tremendous decision-making, hard decision-making and figuring out our way forward, but also brings with it tremendous opportunity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the environment, a little bit about what our Department of Defense has done in responding to the environment, and then I'll talk about what our Air Force has done. Serving as a general, four-star general in the Air Force, I've had the opportunity to sit in a number of decision meetings in which we are charting our course forward in this reduced resource environment. But what I really want to spend a little bit of time on is sharing with you all what my organization, Air Force Materiel Command, has done in this reduced resource environment to embrace that opportunity that presented itself. And for me, it was leading my command through a historic reorganization that is already, after just 1 year of operation, reaping tremendous benefits for my command, for our Air Force, and ultimately for our nation. So that's a little precursor of what I wanted to talk to you all about tonight. So I'll start with the nation's economy, and I really feel like I'm in an audience where I could ask you to tell me about the nation's economy. But so I picked a few quotes that I thought were pertinent relative to our Department of Defense. I start in August of 2010 when our then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, said that he felt that the single biggest threat to our national security was at that time, and he has said this even more recently, and remains our national debt. He went on to say that he felt that the Department of Defense has a responsibility to help eliminate that threat, and he said that we must and we will do our part. So you fast forward just a few months into the spring of 2011 when the debate amongst our elected officials intensified as to how to handle that, our country's fiscal situation. And you all know that the congressional response was the Budget Control Act of 2011 and the possibility at that time, characterized as a possibility of sequestration, the automatic across-the-board cuts that would be applied to both defense and non-defense if a deficit reduction bill was not passed. It was our Secretary of Defense at that time, Secretary Gates, who began the dialogue that said that our Department of Defense had, in fact, begun to do its part. It talked about that even prior to the Budget Control Act, we had taken on at the Department of Defense level the cancellation of, he characterized 20 troubled or excess programs that, if pursued to completion, would have cost more than $300 billion. And you all know that as part of the Budget Control Act, before we began talking about the sequestration mechanism, that there was a portion of that bill that directed the Department of Defense to take a $487 billion reduction over those 10 years, the 10-year timeline of the Budget Control Act, even before we began to discuss whether or not there would be additional reductions. And so when you add those together, we began this journey really with about an $800 billion reduction in what we had anticipated would be spend that our elected officials would allow us to execute in the Department of Defense. And then, a little bit more than a year ago, sequestration, in fact, did trigger. That entailed a 9% decrease across all of our accounts with the exception of our military personnel and our war budget, our OCO budget, operational contingency operations budget. and that was in March of last year. And as a result, the entire department, and I'll speak particularly to our United States Air Force, ended up taking what had been intended to be a full year's worth of reductions in what amounted to a little bit more than a half of that fiscal year that we had remaining. My perspective is that forced us to take some very tactical decisions. We didn't have time or the opportunity to really get after a more strategic, thoughtful way of absorbing those sequestered budgets. That resulted in our Air Force in substantial readiness impacts. We had to reduce our flying hour program. That resulted in standing down squadrons, 30 squadrons that we stood down. We took reductions in as many areas as we could in that very short period of time, and mostly those were in our O&M accounts because those are one-year monies, and it's a little bit more ready opportunity to take those reductions. So we did things like, for those Air Force folks in the room or those who know Air Force operations, we canceled our red flags. We canceled our weapons school classes. We canceled air shows across the whole of the Department of Defense. We stood our Thunderbirds down, which you'd argue is an opportunity to excite the next generation of folks who might want to come in and join the military service. And in my world in particular, my demographics in my command, I have about 75% of my command that are civilians, civil servants, and we went through an administrative furlough last summer, historically unprecedented, asked every one of those airmen, we characterize our uniformed and our civil servants as airmen in the United States Air Force. We asked a portion of our team to take a 20% pay cut for 6 weeks during the summer and had no intention of paying them back. We've gone through other furloughs. In fact, we followed with a furlough at the end of the fiscal year last year. Those are not historically unprecedented when we come to the end of a fiscal year, and our Congress has not had the success in giving us an appropriations bill that allows us to continue operation in the federal government. My experience, and I believe historically it's factual, that every time that we've had a furlough over the course of a changeover in a fiscal year, we have in fact reimbursed our folks who were impacted, our civil servants who were told to stay home. So the administrative furlough that we went through last summer was historically unprecedented in a whole lot of ways. We had people who had personal hardships as a result. We had mission impacts that were tremendous, and in fact, if you talk to the folks in my command, the vast majority of them, they tell you that it was the mission impacts that bothered them even more than the personal hardships that resulted. I believe, as I'm trying to track kind of repercussions in my command, again, 75% of my command is civil service, unlike any of the other major commands in the Air Force. I think we are not even yet fully understanding what the longer-term impacts are. We had people who had agreed to come in to service. We had made offers, and they had agreed to accept those offers, who in the end decided that because of that uncertainty in the job market that they were unwilling to join. We had people whose college degrees we paid for who were in that situation, who agreed that they would reimburse our government as a result of their decision not to join. I had senior grade civil servants, senior most leaders, general officer equivalents, who decided that they were going to leave service as a result of the inability to, it wasn't just the pay cut for them, it was the drastically reduced travel, in particular in my science and technology arena. That's the lifeblood of some of our scientists, to stay connected to the international and national engineering and scientific community, and we were foreclosing those opportunities for them. So I do believe that I'm continuing to collect data and truly understand the impact. I've had the opportunity to be a spokesperson in the senior leadership discussions that have resulted since, and I am actually very pleased to see that in all of the dialogue that's occurred post fiscal year 13, there has been a consensus that we do not anticipate nor want to use that tool in our toolkit ever again. I think the ramifications are too great. So if I think now about the Department of Defense's reaction writ large to that environment that we were facing, and you go all the way back to that 2010 time frame and then move forward, I think that our Department of Defense continued to embrace the need to get more efficient in the work that we do. So it was actually our Secretary of Defense at the time, Secretary Gates, who delivered a speech in August of 2010 in which he introduced his efficiencies directive. It was, and actually it was in the same month that Admiral Mullen made his comments about the national debt being our most significant national security threat. Here's what Secretary Gates said. As a matter of principle and political reality, the Department of Defense cannot expect America's elected representatives to approve budget increases each year unless we are doing a good job, indeed, everything possible to make every dollar count. So Secretary Gates at that point launched the Department of Defense on a path that was characterized as reducing duplication, reducing overhead and excess, and instilling a culture of savings and cost accountability throughout the department. So now let me get to the Air Force reaction to this budgetary environment. I would tell you that my senior leadership in the Air Force took on, in my opinion, a very sound and thoughtful approach to this environment. We had several meetings at the senior-most level, so 4 stars and other MAJCOM commanders in the Air Force, along with our Chief of Staff, Vice Chief, and Secretary of the Air Force. And there was a mandate that we would not immediately deep dive into the decision-making that would ultimately result in figuring out our way forward with a reduced top line. Instead, we talked about what it is that makes the United States Air Force unique. What is it that we bring to the joint fight? What is it that we must continue to execute from a mission perspective in order to best serve our nation? It was, here's the way I characterize it, we had a great dialogue on what's our DNA. What's our DNA as a United States Air Force? And that discussion drove us all the way back to our heritage, so it goes all the way back to 1947 when the United States Air Force was formed as a separate service, as its own institution. We came to the conclusion that the 5 missions, the core missions that we execute today, are the same 5 core missions that we were handed back in 1947 in our initial charter. And those missions are air and space superiority, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, rapid global mobility, global strike, and command and control. Now, certainly what's changed is how we accomplish those missions. So if you think back to the 1940s, we are certainly using technologies today that probably would have seemed like science fiction back to our founders back in that era of 6+ decades ago. And of course, we're now talking about domains that we never talked about in 1947, right? We have a space domain that wasn't on anybody's horizon, and more recently, a cyber domain. And so while some things have changed in terms of the way in which we go about executing those missions and in the domains in which we operate, the reality was there was a recognition that those 5 core missions that we were chartered to execute are the same core missions that we need to ensure we continue to execute for the future. It was really about ensuring that we could continue to provide global vigilance, global reach, and global power for our country. And once we decided then on what those most important things were that we would not cease doing, we then had the opportunity to talk about things that we were doing that perhaps we could stop doing or that we could do less of. And then we had discussions on how do we go about executing those 5 core missions. And it was clear that we couldn't continue on the path that we had been on because we had planned on having a much higher top line to execute those core missions than we anticipated we would have, not just for 1 year or 2 years, but for the next 10 years. And then that brought with it a reality that we needed to embrace a smaller Air Force. And that's what you've seen in the FY15 President's budget that has been forwarded just last month. It was released in the month of March. We have learned from some of our past. We have been very clear that we will not allow a hollow force. You may have heard that terminology in the past. So what we have proposed to the Congress is a smaller but ready force in the near term, a recognition that our responsibility in executing those 5 missions is to ensure that we can defeat a full-spectrum, high-end threat into the future. So while we will remain a smaller Air Force for the future, we have held dear those modernization, recapitalization programs that we believe are absolutely essential for us to be able to defeat those high-end threats. And so in future, we will have a smaller, ready, and very capable force against those threats that we anticipate that we will need to be able to defeat on behalf of our country. I would tell you that one of the other aspects of what we've done in all of the dialogue that we've had is to recognize that we need to take on a much more long-term view of how we can balance the needs of the Air Force. And so there is a capability, a capacity, a readiness balance that needs to be addressed, not just for the first couple of years of a FIDIP, but for well beyond that. We'd gotten away from that, I would tell you, in our Air Force when I was a captain many years ago. I used to be a part of a strategic planning process that enforced looking out 20 years. And so we realized that you couldn't recapitalize everything at the same time. You needed to allow for each one of those major acquisition activities to have a turn. And it would take about 20 years to cycle through all of the various capabilities that we would need to be able to execute those key missions. And so one of the changes, one of the adjustments that we have embraced, and in fact I'm headed to the Pentagon, not tomorrow but the next day, to have one of our first dialogues at that 4-star level to do what we are characterizing as a strategic planning choices meeting, which looks not just at the near term but looks at that longer range to determine what are those things that we have absolutely got to fit within a reduced top line for the future, and how will they all fit so that we're not starting things, realizing a bow wave post-FIDIP and not being able to efficiently execute to a budget that we need to be able to deliver those critical warfighting capabilities. All right, so let me take you now to what we've done in Materiel Command. We have, before I talk you a little bit through what we've done, perhaps it would help for me to share with you a little bit about what Materiel Command is for those of you who may not be as familiar as a few in the room that I carried with me here tonight. So let me just share that we have established our mission in Materiel Command as we're a support mission, so we are a support command. Our mission is to equip the Air Force for world-dominant air power. And we do that by developing, fielding, and sustaining the systems that allow, I maintain, our United States Air Force to remain the most capable, flexible, and dominant Air Force in the world today. So we've already heard that I execute that mission with about 80,000 people. That's one of the largest major commands in our Air Force, kind of rival Air Combat Command as the largest command. But we have about 12% of the manpower in the Air Force in my command. That 12% of the manpower executes, as Dr. Posen said, on the order of 50 to $60 billion on an annual basis, which equates to about 40% of the budget. So it's an extraordinary responsibility in my command. Dr. Posen noted that I've got 4 primary missions. I have the Air Force Research Laboratory in my command, so world-class scientists who are working on not only technologies that will help us preserve our ability to execute those 5 core missions and others well into the future, but also react on an urgent basis to COCOM needs today. We have warfighting capability that our research laboratory delivered in the last series of wars that we've been through in Iraq and Afghanistan. The second mission is one of life cycle management. We characterize that as cradle to grave oversight of the various warfighting capabilities that we deliver. So we start with a requirement for a need. We go through a design, a development, a production, a fielding, a support, and then ultimately a disposal phase for those various weapon systems and warfighting capabilities. I've put all that into one mission set called life cycle management. And we have a third mission of developmental test and evaluation. So I have the ability through some great infrastructures, through some world-class test pilots and test engineers to wring out those warfighting capabilities before we deliver them to the warfighter so that they in fact do what they were intended to do. And then my fourth mission is a sustainment mission. I have the depots for the Air Force, 3 depots who are responsible for depot maintenance across a vast majority of our fleets. Those that we handle organically, some we do in leveraging our industry partner with a contractor logistics support approach. And my sustainment mission includes one of supply chain. So I am responsible in my command for 24/7 delivery of pieces and parts where they're needed throughout the Air Force and beyond to ensure that that folks who need those assets can have them to execute their missions. So what did we do in response to this environment? I'll tell you, our leadership in the Air Force said that given the magnitude of the reductions, they asked each and every one of the leaders in the Air Force to envision strategic responses to this fiscal challenge, this fiscal environment. And so what we put forward in Materiel Command is what I would characterize as a major reorganization that actually reinvented my command and resulted in an opportunity to significantly increase our efficiency and effectiveness in executing those 4 critical missions. So I'll give you a little bit more history here before I launch into what we did. So back in 1992, there used to be 2 different major commands in our Air Force that did the work that I do in Materiel Command today. They were our Air Force Systems Command and our Air Force Logistics Command. And back in 1992, we merged those 2 commands under a construct that we then called Integrated Weapon System Management, IWSM. It was that cradle-to-grave oversight of delivery of warfighting capability and support of that capability. So at that time of the merger, we merged at the headquarters level, but we did not take on the task of looking at the subordinate levels within the organization. And so at that time in 1992, we had 18 in my world, centers. In the rest of the Air Force, we call them NAFs, Numbered Air Forces, but in Air Force Materiel Command, they're called centers. 18 reporting to the newly formed Air Force Materiel Commander. Over the course of the next 20 years, we did some merging, we did some divesting, we did some inactivations, and we took that number from 18 down to 12. But as we entered into this fiscally reduced environment, 12 was still an extraordinary amount of overhead associated with those 4 missions that I accomplished, and really was out of balance with the rest of the Air Force in terms of how we were organized. And so let me tell you, kind of give you a feel for how it used to be under this 12-center construct before we did our reorganization. So we had some of those 12 centers performing multiple of those 4 missions. We had several centers performing each of those missions, and in every case we had those centers executing those missions with different processes. There wasn't a standard process that we used across each of those centers. We were very geographically organized. Wherever those centers resided geographically, whatever missions executed at that geographic location, that commander that we put in charge executed to the best of their ability those mission sets at that geographic location. So as an example, for my test mission, I had 3 test centers then. I had Edwards Air Force Base, Eglin Air Force Base, and Arnold Air Force Base, 3 of my 9 bases in my command, and each one of them had completely different procedures, and so for the folks who needed to rely on the test community to get tests done, they had to learn each one of those different procedures and processes and practice and tools and oversight mechanisms that those centers were each individually executing. That theme was actually consistent across all of my centers. So if I think about lifecycle management or product support, that I had the same circumstance that went on there. I had the same circumstance at each one of my depots, each one of them executing that depot maintenance function differently. And so what we had then was entirely different processes throughout the command, multiple faces to our primary customer, who is our warfighter, and really significant inefficiencies as a result. So what we proposed in response to our senior leadership's challenge to present strategic initiatives was a whole new organization for Air Force Materiel Command. As I said, I kind of characterized it as a reinvention, and what we did was organize around those core missions. So I went from 12 centers to 5. You might ask, I had 4 missions. I have 5 centers. Those 4 missions each had a center aligned to them. The 5th center is one in my command that is dedicated to our nuclear mission. And the reality is I've got a nuclear weapons center that does pieces and parts of each of those 4 missions, but given the importance in my service in the United States Air Force and the fact that our number 1 priority is to continue to strengthen our nuclear enterprise, we decided that singular focus on the nuclear mission in my command made a lot of sense even in this reorganization. So I presented this to the senior leadership in the Air Force. I and actually my predecessor, Materiel Command Commander, both had the opportunity to dialogue and gain concurrence on this new way of doing business within Materiel Command. So this new organizational structure is clearly more efficient. So you have to realize that what Secretary Gates asked us to do was eliminate overhead and redundancy. And so what I now have is 5 centers versus 12. So all of the overhead associated at the staff level for the centers that no longer exist, I didn't need to keep on the books. So I was able to take more than 1,000 positions off the books, which equated to more than $100 million on an annual basis out of the budget from a manpower perspective. But I have to tell you, so that's why we started this. It was in response to that efficiency mandate by the Secretary of Defense. What I'm most excited about is the effectiveness, the mission effectiveness that we've realized from this new organizational structure. So I now have a single center with a single commander who works across all of those geographic locations, takes on those missions in their execution at an enterprise level, gets after leveraging the best practices and lessons learned regardless of where it was occurring geographically, and gets after standardizing the processes and practices. The word I've taken to using is that it's been powerful for us as an organization to realize the benefits that we could gain by organizing differently. So, 1 year of operation. I wanted to share with you where we've come. Just 1 year. 1 year later, we've been able to standardize 85 processes. We're on the road to more than 150 by the end of this calendar year. We were able to rescind some unnecessary instructions, 44 of them. So, in my world, in the military world, fewer directives is a better thing for creativity and innovation. We embraced a cost-effectiveness mindset. Keep in mind, we're responsible for 40% of the Air Force spend, so I challenged my command to figure out ways in this new organizational construct by which we could get more cost-efficient at what we do. So after 1 year of operation, I have a number of examples. I'll share one with you. In that depot arena, in that depot maintenance mission set, we have sales rates. It's a working capital fund, reimbursable fund that we execute that mission set with. We were able to reduce our rates for fiscal year 15, so we presented that in the fiscal year 15 President's budget that just went over through collaboration across two centers, my Lifecycle Management Center, my Sustainment Center. So my engineers who are responsible for each of my individual weapon systems sit in the Lifecycle Management Center. My expertise, the folks that turn wrenches and actually accomplish that depot maintenance, sit in my Sustainment Center. So collaboration across those two centers resulted in a reduction in that depot sales rate by 5%. So some of you might be thinking 5% doesn't seem like very much. A 5% reduction in my depot sales rate resulted in me giving back to my Air Force in a tough fiscal environment, $503 million in fiscal year 15, and that $503 million perpetuates for the future as we continue to figure out how we can get more mission and cost effective in the work that we do. So as I added it up, and I'm giving you just one example tonight, each one of my centers has embraced this mandate to get cost conscious in the work that they do, and I can point to more than $3 billion of either cost savings or cost avoidance that we've been able to identify in just 1 year of operating in this manner. It's powerful. That's my word. So now let me talk to you about the fact that this environment, in my opinion, is what allowed me to present this initiative to gain the approval to proceed and to make it a reality. And the reason I say that is that I mentioned that our command has been in existence for more than 20 years. I'm not the first commander who came up with this idea. I would tell you that portions of it, maybe not the wholesale reorganization, but certainly portions of it had been envisioned and presented and been denied over the course of the last 20 years of this command's in existence. And I think, as I think about this, what does this environment bring that allowed this to be given the approval to proceed? I believe that it's the environment in those times when this type of a change was presented was really not conducive to gaining that approval. In the environment that we are in right now, there is a burning platform, and so without that burning platform, I maintain there is this old adage that seems to come into play. It's, if it's not broken, don't fix it. If there is risk associated with change, then we're not willing to take on that risk in some cases. In today's environment, there is a hunger to figure out how we can get more efficient at mission execution, and that is what opened that aperture for us to be able, not without difficulty. If anybody has a question on the congressional interaction with this reorganization, I'd be happy to answer that. I would tell you that it was not well received when we initially exposed this as an initiative we wanted to pursue. But in the end, we prevailed. And again, I maintain that it is because of the environment. So as difficult as this resource environment is, as challenging as it is, my mantra to my workforce and audiences that I get a chance to engage with is that I have never seen more receptivity, more willingness to listen to good ideas and to have those good ideas get a fair hearing in my 34 years in this, wearing this uniform than I see right now. And so my message to my workforce is bring it on. What's my next challenge? I'm encouraging all of them to share with me their good ideas for the work that they do in those 4 critical missions that we execute on behalf of the Air Force. So, in conclusion, I'm at the conclusion part, Dr. Posen. And I believe it is an absolutely great time to lead in the United States Air Force, despite the environment. And I believe it's a wonderful time to execute my critical mission for our Air Force and for our nation. I have the privilege to serve in an institution that truly does embrace opportunities in this challenging, changing environment. Every day I have the opportunity to lead an organization that's responsible for equipping the world's greatest Air Force for world-dominant air power. It is an awesome responsibility that the men and women of Air Force Materiel Command are very proud to accomplish. So thank you again for inviting me to speak tonight. I'd be happy to take any questions, and I know there are several that you might have. Thanks very much.
I promised the general in my usual mystical way to keep the question and answer list. I do the questions, she does the answers. So.
And he's been taking notes.
If you have a question, I'll note your name. I see Wayne Andrews is into the breach. So.
Thank you very much. The remarks were excellent, and it sounds like you've accomplished quite a bit in a very short period of time. What I'm wondering is what has been the cost to all this reduction? Right? Is it a readiness cost? Is it, I'm skeptical that it's all getting to it. So what is it? Manpower cost? What's been the most difficult challenge as a result of all this stuff?
To my command, are you asking, or to the Air Force writ large? To my command. So my command is a support command, and so I need to kind of understand where my Air Force is headed in the decision-making that they've done, and certainly I've had a seat at that table to help articulate my perspective in that regard. But in the end, it's those key decisions on what warfighting capability do we need to be able to have on the books to continue to execute those critical missions that we've had those tough strategic trades and decision-making that we executed really last summer, getting through a POM and a budgeting process. And then my responsibility as we go through that process is to ensure that I accurately collect and report and get included impacts to my support mission. So, for instance, we have program offices that are responsible for overseeing the delivery of that warfighting capability. If a program is coming off the books, then that's manpower reduction that comes off of my books that correspond to that. The President's budget that was sent over last month eliminated whole fleets, our A-10 and our U-2 fleets, and so there is a whole logistical tail that's associated with that I'm responsible for ensuring I understand how we can adequately, accurately capture the whole of the reduction that occurs as a result of an entire fleet elimination. So there are clearly impacts. I do not want to in any way imply that by me finding a silver lining in a very, very difficult resource environment implies that that there isn't hardship, and there is. There is great concern, actually, about our risk to execute the mission sets that we're responsible for executing with far fewer resources and far fewer people to execute them. Yeah, thank
Jim
you.
Walsh?
I wanted to ask you about a topic that some of us have to address soon, and that is the rebalance to Asia. And so what does that mean? I mean, it's going to happen, right? So somehow we're supposed to leave the Middle East even though it calls our name every day. And now Russia and Ukraine, I'm sure, sends a pulse through the system. But also we're supposed to go to Asia.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean for your command? And how do you see that? How in a world in which the top line's coming down, how do we get out of the Middle East and or do less in order to do more?
Wow. So you would not hear any of our senior leadership say in the Air Force, and I don't believe in the Department of Defense, that we want to get out of some of the areas that we are in today, other than drawing down. Okay, thank you, thank you. So there needs to be a balance, clearly, and I do absolutely agree with you that we had been very focused on that pivot to the Pacific, and for my command, it's understanding what the materiel impacts of that would be. We already have a whole host of capability that exists today in that AOR, the ability to expand to be able to house and base additional capability is something that falls to my command. Actually, I wear the Agile Combat Support Core Function Lead Integrator hat for the Air Force, and so my responsibility is to ensure understanding of when we stand up new bases, what does that mean in terms of a resource investment. But I absolutely agree with you, sir, that the world events that have unfolded between Russia and Ukraine, I think give us pause in terms of an area of the world that, from my personal opinion, we had thought we had some stability that needs to be understood in terms of what the implications are. We are planning for it potentially being a long-term kind of activity that we need to be ready to support, and so that will drive us, I think, to dialogue and discussion internal to the department, but also I think with our elected officials as to the way forward.
Thank you. You identified the nuclear mission as a top priority for the Air Force as a whole, as well as for your command. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. As I look at, just reading the newspaper, the nuclear mission-related acquisition, sustainment decisions that are being made, I look at the long-range strike bomber, which is the latest iteration of our new next-generation bomber platform we've been talking about for quite a long time. I see the F-35 program, which we've been talking about making nuclear capable for quite a while, but I don't know yet when the deadline is for that. I see the B-61 Mod 12, the new nuclear gravity bomb in training, which we're currently doing testing on. And I see that we've decided to diminish the number of Minuteman missiles that we keep operational by 50. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what I see just as an outsider looking in, as sort of the tension between the priority that the Air Force affords the nuclear mission against the fact that a lot of these programs, I at least, from my outsider's perspective, I see a series of delays over a long period of time. Maybe that's a misperception on my part.
Yeah. I would tell you that the nuclear mission competes with all of the other things that we believe are also important to do. We have a number of activities underway. You mentioned several of them. We're also looking at a ground-based strategic deterrent analysis of alternatives that is underway even now to address our ICBM fleet and the fact that it's been fielded since the 60s and getting very old and difficult to sustain, although we have plans to be able to sustain it out to 2030. So we have plans for each one of those nuclear assets in terms of either extensions of service life so that they can continue to accomplish the missions that they accomplish now, or the follow-on recapitalization kinds of efforts in each one of those areas that we're responsible for, two legs of the triad that the Air Force is responsible for. So I think out of the three programs that I would tell you are those that we believe are absolutely essential to ensure stay on track to their current schedule to be able to address those high-end threats are two of those that you mentioned. So the F-35 and the long-range strike bomber, you will not see, I don't believe, our Air Force leadership backing off on the need to keep those activities on schedule. And then you couple that with the munitions that need to go with the airborne platforms and the fact that we are looking at what that next generation of a ground-based ICBM type of a capability is. And I think we've got all the right attention placed in the nuclear arena from a sustainment and recapitalization effort. The real question becomes, as we get through some of those early stages of those efforts, finding the wherewithal within that reduced top line, looking out in that strategic way that we have embraced looking out, how we're going to fit it all in, given everything else that we've got going on. And those are the conversations that I think we're going to have on Thursday at the Pentagon. Clearly, something that is, as we said, a top priority, the number one priority for our Air Force. I imagine we're going to make sure that we find a way forward on getting those recapitalization and sustainment activities funded.
Cindy?
I want to follow up on Nina's question about the challenges of doing the big reorganization, because the ones you talked about were more the external ones. But a lot of times the biggest challenges are internal. It's getting people to understand that this is life now. And a lot of times there are cultural clashes among the communities, especially when they each had their own way of doing business. So I wonder, first of all, if you could talk about the internal challenges and how you conquered them, how you've gotten past them in the year. But also, if this worked inside AFMC, is it possible that there's room to go farther among the services in the material world?
So, okay, Cindy, that's at least 3 questions, right? So, okay, two questions. All right, so let's see.
She's been retired for 6 months.
Well, this is great. This is great. Let's see. So let me address the first question first. I would say that this was a huge cultural change for my command, and that brought with it a need to address change management and understanding that human dynamic of figuring our way forward to give people a voice in all of these changes, to listen to their concerns, to figure it out to the best of our ability before we launched it, to understand that we weren't going to get it 100% right when we did launch, to be willing to continue to evolve as we executed in this new organizational construct and the learning started to occur where we maybe had gotten something not quite right. I would tell you that the things from my perspective that we didn't get right were those things that I characterize as tactical level kinds of things that needed to be addressed, but not from a strategic perspective of was this the better way to organize to get the mission accomplished. So I've just spent the last couple of days visiting a couple of my bases, locations. Rome is no longer a base, but I have a large contingent of scientists and engineers at Rome. Was there yesterday. Today I spent all day at Hanscom Air Force Base. And, you know, I never demand. I always listen to the feedback that I get. And I had the briefings that I took today from Hanscom Air Force Base, an organization that was substantially impacted by this reorganization. We had a 3-star general officer who was in charge of a center up at Hanscom. We no longer have a center at Hanscom. It's aligned to one of those 5 centers that remains. We dropped the senior most ranking person here from a 3-star down to a 2-star. And so substantial change to the organization here. I had people tell me throughout the day that they are utterly convinced that this is a better way to organize, and they're already starting to see the benefits. Because when the geographic boundary was drawn and there was an expectation that you lived within that geographic boundary to get your mission accomplished, that it was harder, not that you couldn't do it, but it was harder to work outside the geographic boundary, to figure out if somebody else had a better idea, if there was a different way to get something done, if there was an opportunity to collaborate across technology growth or a different way of getting a mission accomplished. And those boundaries are gone now. There was a description to me today that there is great collaboration across all of the entities that we hold accountable for our life cycle management. We call them PEOs, Program Executive Officers. And so before you used to have PEOs that had responsibility for a center. Now we don't have that anymore. So now we have PEOs that are routinely talking to each other and sharing their lessons learned and best practices. It was resounding. I'm excited about being on the forefront because I think we're not yet fully understanding the benefits that can come from this new organizational structure. So it has been a need to understand that it was going to be a culture change to address the concerns that all of my workforce were willing to raise. We're only coming up on 2 years into this, so I declared IOC in October of 2012. So it'll be just 2 years of formally operating in this new structure this year. I think probably there's still more discovery to be had. I think that particularly in our world, we have folks that work in the business for lengthy periods of time, and sometimes I think they think it's easy just to try hard to wait things out if it's a change that they don't particularly like. And so I'm sure that there is still some of that still out there, but I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing so far. Now, relative to whether or not I think this is transferable to the other services, it's interesting to see how each of us as services have chosen to organize in order to get the Materiel mission accomplished. So I'd say probably closest to the Air Force would be the way the Army is organized, although it's still not exactly the same from their perspective of having a 4-star general in charge of their Materiel command. The Navy has clearly organized it differently. They've, I kind of characterize this as taking more of a product line organizational structure, and so you have a NAVAIR and a NAVC and an SSP that is responsible for a product group, and they cross-cut, for the most part, all 4 of those mission sets that I said, that we've kind of organized along. So it could be that there is some merit in doing some sharing. In fact, the Army Materiel Command commander has been working really hard to find some time that he and I can connect. He's heard about the reorganization that we've gone through, and he's excited to understand what we've done. I think that trying to execute something similar in the Navy just may not lend itself quite as well, just given it's almost 180 out in terms of the way that they're organized. But where there is opportunity, I'm more than happy to share and learn. Thanks.
Bill Hahn. General, thank you for your comments. Colonel Phil Hahn, a graduate from here and an A-10 driver by trade. My original question was the one Cindy just asked, so I waited. I didn't think it was going to be asked, but she asked it. But I had a follow-up. 5 years ago, General Schwartz came and had the same award, and I probably heard jointness mentioned 20 times. Tonight, I haven't heard the word joint mentioned at all. And I'm sitting around with several joint officers, and we were talking earlier about, when there's constraints, there is a tendency for the services to break with jointness in terms of going after the remaining assets that are available. And we were talking about some manifestations, whether or not that's cracking or not. So one of my first questions is what you've seen in that arena, particularly as our ops start to draw down, and maybe this need for day-to-day joint operations becomes less and less to the degree to which the Air Force begins to look back at its own service prerogatives. My second question is just kind of inside the room with the 4 stars, which I'm not there, but you mentioned the accepted model, which is the 5 different missions the Air Force has done since its inception. But I can see there's a bunch of smart guys and women in the room there at the time. What alternative models were also discussed as far as to go forward? I understand that once the decision's made, the door's closed, but were there other alternatives that might be considered in the future that weren't chosen, and what were the reasons behind that?
Wow, 2 very intense questions. So let's see, joint and why I haven't mentioned it tonight. Clearly that I don't want anybody again to take away that being a part of the joint team is not absolutely essential for all services in terms of getting through all of the various missions that we execute. It is absolutely critical. In my world, there are fewer opportunities to get after that. There are certainly opportunities, for instance, in the depot world, we compete with each other as services to figure out who has the best expertise to execute in that depot maintenance arena. And by the same token, then we understand where the strengths are across all of the services. Don't think that there is much else other than, well, there's collaboration in the science and technology arena across the services as well. Certainly in my laboratory, the Air Force Research Laboratory, there is a recognition that there are some areas of expertise that are unique to each service, and so we tend to share resources to understand where we can best leverage those resources in areas where some entity is perhaps more advanced and more capable than others. So it's not that we operate jointly in the Materiel world, I guess, would be kind of what I characterize you as why perhaps I haven't stressed the need for jointness in my talk to you tonight. Certainly, that's something that has been well recognized in the ops world. That is it's a mandatory kind of going in proposition that we've all got to be able to operate and interoperate not only jointly across the services but with our coalition partners as well. So then, let's see. Your next question was.
The 4 stars in the room. Alternative models for going forward?
We're So it wasn't a doctoral thesis that we took on as we kind of had those discussions about what makes us United States Air Force. There certainly was dialogue on the fact, and I'm sure that this is something that you may read frequently, that every service has an air component and air arm, and so there was dialogue on how do we articulate, do we believe that the service that we provide is unique to the point of demanding that we still remain a separate service. We had those kind of discussions, but beyond that, and clearly came to the conclusion that we can articulate, we think very eloquently that it is absolutely essential for this country that we maintain a separate service that is a United States Air Force. But beyond that, I don't know that we took a detailed study on different models that we would operate. We took instead an approach that said, what are all the missions that we execute today? And out of all of those, what are those that we just simply have to keep doing? Are there things that we're not doing that we ought to be doing? So that was more of the dialogue that we undertook. Yeah.
I actually have a question myself.
Now I'm worried.
I'll get this out right. But as I understand the general pattern of cost growth in the Pentagon, for any given force structure, costs nevertheless have a tendency to go up kind of monotonically, a couple, 1%, 2%, 3% real a year. I'm not sure what the number usually is. Some of that falls on procurement of new weapon systems, which always seem to be more expensive than the things that are replaced. Some of it seems to be in some of the O&M. So what I was wondering is both in terms of these two mission areas, the life cycle management and the depot maintenance. You talked about sort of efficiencies across the board of the organization that allowed you to save on manpower and overhead, this, that, and the other. But what about the actual task of managing these weapon systems over their life cycle? What about the actual task of bringing weapon systems back and whatever you do, stripping them down to the metal and rebuilding them? If you saw that once at Tinker on the 135s or something. So are there ways to make that more efficient, to squeeze some of the cost growth out of that? Or is this just somehow some natural fact that these costs are going to go?
So we are focused on that. Thanks for asking that question. Across the board in each of those centers, and I gave you one example of the depot sales rates going down. In the sustainment center, in particular on those lines, as we do the depot maintenance, the really deep maintenance that needs to be done to ensure that those weapon systems can continue to perform their missions, we have taken an approach that is very comprehensive. The three-star general, Lieutenant General Bruce Litchfield, who runs my Air Force Sustainment Center, firmly believes that there is an Air Force Sustainment Center way that he has codified in a book that includes a leadership model, so it's about ensuring his folks understand his leadership principles and tenets. It includes what he characterizes as the scientific method for getting after this depot maintenance, and it's about theory of constraints and buffer, a drum zone, and words that I'm not as familiar with. So it's, but he's got a very scientific approach to the actual execution of the mission set, and then he's got an ability to oversee and drive reporting that is consistent, so that he has a dashboard and an ability to understand where things aren't going as well as they need to go, so that he can apply attention. So he's got various tenets of his AFSC way that he has mandated across each one of the various geographic sites that he is responsible for, and he's starting to see that ability to execute that mission set in a much more cost-effective manner. And he has a construct that he has presented all the way up to the senior leadership in the Air Force, to Corona, our 4-star level meetings, of what he characterizes as cost-effective readiness. He believes what he provides our Air Force is readiness. And so he is after not just mission effective, but now figuring out how he can get at cost-effective readiness. And so part of that is the work that he can do internal to his center to get at the standard processes and practices, the scientific method, getting a repeatable set of work, understanding when you bring an airplane in, that you've done all of the inspections so that you know what pieces and parts you're going to need, and you're not having to delay that airplane down a line as you're waiting for those parts. And so there is an approach that he has undertaken to universally apply. That's within his purview of responsibility. He's got another layer of cost-effective readiness that includes work that can be done across centers within our command, but also work that can be done across MAJCOMs. For instance, we are working on, the depot rates reduction was one of them that we worked across center. He's got some other initiatives that he has underway in terms of working with the various major commands and having that close collaboration with them as they bring their assets in to his depots. And then at the highest tier level, he characterized this as cost-effective readiness at the Air Force level, and he believes that there is a different way we can think about readiness in our Air Force if we're willing to take this on. So in a reduced budget environment, he believes that there is opportunity to get after centralization of our repair network in a way that we have not yet taken on. So we have duplication across each one of our bases in terms of our maintenance facilities at the organizational level, to include back shops. And so not flight line stuff, but the back shops. There's perhaps an opportunity to get after more regionalization of those capabilities and the assets that need to flow. There's an opportunity to get after how much readiness in terms of our spares packages and our engines that we absolutely believe we need in a wartime setting, and do we have that right size? So we spend an awful lot of money getting those RSP kits and WRE engine levels where they are today, and the reality is in some of those cases we're spending money that's driving us to well above the requirement but in any O plan. So is there an opportunity there to get after right sizing that? And then he's got an even more far-reaching idea, which is, today we judge ourselves in readiness across our fleets with a metric that we call aircraft availability. Those aircraft availability numbers by fleet are driven by our war plans, and so it's all about being able to go to war every day. And so his suggestion is that perhaps we need to take on a different model that says that during peacetime you probably don't need to have each and every tail in our fleet at that level of readiness, that as long as we can demonstrate an ability to surge to get to that readiness, and of course he owns our depots, he'd be the one to make sure that we could in fact accomplish that surge, that perhaps there's a way to get after readiness that we need in the time frame in which we need it, but in a more cost-effective manner. So that's just an example across one of my centers. It's huge the work that he has going on. On the acquisition side, on that lifecycle management side, we've embraced in my command the should cost construct, and so you're probably familiar with that. OSD, AT&L has asked across all of our acquisition activities to embrace after you award a contract for a particular warfighting capability delivery. It is absolutely true in this world that you don't ever have an absolutely clear crystal ball. Things unfold and change as you execute to that program, and sometimes things go in the wrong direction. They're costing more, they're taking longer. Sometimes you discover that perhaps you don't have to pay as much for delivery of that warfighting capability. So it's all about making sure that we only pay the amount of money that we believe we need to pay in order to have that warfighting capability delivered. And so that's our should cost construct, and the work that we're doing so far has identified in the order of billions of dollars that we think that we can get after that allow us to deliver that warfighting capability, but for fewer resources. So work going on across the board, not only in the organization and the freeing up of manpower, but in the actual execution of the mission. If that was your question.
General, thanks for being here. I'm going to ask a very selfish question from my career field, but General Sheldon has spoken a lot recently on disaggregation. And I just would like to know your thoughts on that as far as, hey, how long of a time frame are we talking to actually see something? Is it 7 years, 10 years down the road? And will we be able to see it through to fruition if that's the route we choose to go? And then what's the decision process to actually say, yep, that's the way we're going?
So that's a great question, Colin. But you understand that the way we're organized today, General Shelton actually owns space acquisition, and so I'm not as well versed in the specifics of the timing, but certainly in our 4-star level discussions, he has been really very clear on, from his perspective, that this is a much better way for us to proceed in the space arena. Feels that where we have been headed has become very costly, very no-fail in terms of our ability to execute to those large satellites and getting them up on station. He thinks that we, as an Air Force, would be much better served to go after smaller packets of capability, being able to be more agile and flexible, having launch capabilities that lend themselves to getting those kind of capabilities up in a much more agile manner. So that's about as much as I can tell you. Again, not really within the work that I oversee on a day-to-day basis. Thanks.
So, 2 questions. Thank you very much for the remarks. The first one is to follow up a little bit on Jim's question, just to ask specifically within your command, what changes, if any, have you seen as a result of the gender to Asia policy? And the second question is that I was quite struck by your comment that you have lost a number of research scientists as a result of the budgetary issues, and that sounded unprecedented, and I was just wondering what impact that has had on that area of the Air Force's mission and what you think it would do with it.
Regarding the first question, we haven't yet seen specific impacts of that pivot to the Pacific because we haven't yet taken on specific activities associated with that approach. So it is a construct that we have put in play as part of a president's budget request, but no actual action from my command's perspective yet in terms of activity required. And then your second question dealt with?
On the loss of research science.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that question. So I would tell you that I've got a very deep bench of scientific expertise in our research laboratory. It hurts when we do have folks who choose to move on and do other things, but I would tell you that we have expertise and an ability to hopefully attract folks, sometimes not at those same levels, and so we do have kind of a phenomenon that occurs for us that people who join in the past have wanted to stay for extended periods of time, and in particular in the scientific arena, getting fresh eyes in, getting new thoughts in, getting latest thinking and technology expertise in is a good thing for us. And so in some ways, when we have folks who decide that it's time for them to move on, it actually, as hard as it is, because there's knowledge that goes out the door, it also presents an opportunity to us to re-look at how we're structured. Are there skill sets that we don't currently have on the books that we might want to leverage some of those vacancies to go fill? So there's kind of, I think, some pros and cons associated with loss of some of that intellectual capital. And I would tell you that certainly the folks that I have organically don't even scratch the surface of the folks that we have collaborating with us in the Air Force. So throughout academia, throughout industry, throughout other services, internationally, we've got wonderful opportunities to leverage those skill sets and learn from each other. So again, while it was something that I wouldn't have wanted to have seen happen, the reality is that there is opportunity that comes with it and a very robust laboratory environment in terms of manpower and skill sets. Thanks.
Bless my eyes to see if Harvey Sapolsky has the last one.
General, you're likely the most senior female officer in the Air Force and probably one of the most senior female officers in the U.S. military. What obstacles exist for females in the military, and what's been your experience about being one of the more senior officers that are female in our services?
That's a whole nother speech, but I'd be happy to put that in a thumbnail for you. So I am the military's only 4-star female general today. I am the second one, though. We had the Army hire the first, to promote the first, General Ann Dunwoody. She was just retiring as I was coming on board in June of 12, and I had the opportunity to actually, Time Magazine did a joint interview with us, and I got a chance to get to know her, and I was just utterly impressed with Ann Dunwoody. So I look back on my career, and here's my perspective. So I should start. I told Lisa, who's sitting next to me, a ROTC cadet, that I was in the first class of women that went to one of the service academies. That was a class in 1976 and graduated in 1980. All the service academies opened up to women for the first time in the same year. So my experience starts with an environment in which I think it's fair to say there were cadets at the Air Force Academy who were utterly opposed to Congress changing their experience at an all-male institution at a service academy, and who made it their personal calling to prove that point. Had one of them stop me and tell me he was going to prove that Congress was wrong and get him to reverse that law, so that he would go back to his Air Force Academy as he had joined it. That brought with it some tremendous learning those 4 years, and I would say that for those of you who might be service academy graduates, I think it's true in any case, perhaps a little bit more intense being in the first class of women, that service academies are all about putting you in a stressful environment in any way you can define that. For me, it was learning that I am far more capable than I ever thought I could be, and really leveraging that knowledge, that self-confidence in myself throughout the rest of my career. So now, 34 years later, after having come on active duty, so when we started at the academy, at the Air Force, they brought in 10% of that incoming class were women. We graduated 4 years later with about 10% of the class, so it's about the same attrition rate as they had been experiencing in the time that they had all-male classes. We scheduled the 10% number because that was the number of women in the Air Force writ large. 10% of the manpower in the Air Force were women. So 34 years later, we've almost doubled that. We're at about 19% now. Progress, substantial progress. Representative of the demographics of this country? No. So we've still got a ways to go, in my opinion. When I first came in, there were many, many career fields that were closed to women. Women were just beginning to be allowed to fly in some selected fleets, but not across the board. Today, 99% of our career fields are open to women in the Air Force. And of course, we recently had our Secretary of Defense last year eliminate that combat exclusion provision, which now will open up, or at least offer the opportunity to open up the remainder, not only in the Air Force, but across all the services. We go through some of whatever we got to go through a standards discussion as to what is required for any individual, male or female, to be able to best execute those mission sets. When I first came into the academy, this is amazing to me. I've had women come up and tell me that they were affected by this. There was still an executive order on the books that allowed the service to separate a woman who became pregnant or became a parent in any other manner. So as a step parent by adoption, there was still an executive order on the books in my lifetime that we could separate women. So now we have not only maternity but paternity leave in the United States Air Force. And then I get to the career progression. So we now have, certainly with the Army first, now in the Air Force, and soon, very soon, the Navy. We've got Michelle Howard, who's a 3-star equivalent, who has been confirmed as a 4-star equivalent to serve as the vice CNO when that opening occurs. And so I maintain that we now have women who have achieved the senior-most ranks in each one of our services. And we've got, I think it's last count, 66 women serving at the various grades below that at the general officer level. So I firmly believe that that there is every opportunity for women to continue to grow and prove that, in fact, we can lead and compete in anything that we do across all of the services. It's been an extraordinary journey. I actually had, at one of the symposiums that we go to, a couple of women cadets came up to me, and they were so excited. My aide was with me, and they were running around and trying to get to meet as many senior officers as they could, and they said to me, well, thank goodness we found our first 4-star woman. We've got one down, we just got to find the rest. And I told them they could stop. They were done. They were done. But I told them that the message to them was that they could work hard and aspire to get to this level themselves, and that's a wonderful message to be able to articulate. Thanks for asking that question. All right.